Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us at the Oxford Forum Steps to a Sustainable Future. So, as I just said, my name is Sean Wilden, and if you don't know me, my background is in English language teaching, and I work as an English language teacher, and I also work at the University of Oxford as a digital literacy tutor. And if you've got a good memory, you might have joined us back in 2021 when we hosted a panel discussion on bridging the digital divide, and that was part of the first forum for educators. It was a really lively session. We were just talking before we went live about how lively it was, and it's great to be back again to be able to revisit this issue. And so we're going to find out where we are 2 years after that first panel. So good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Is there a good evening to everybody? I can see we've got a really good global audience in today. So, as part of the commitment to the UN Sustainable Publishers contract, Oxford University Press have aligned this session with the UN Sustainability Goals, reduced inequalities. So over the next hour and a half, we'll be talking about the digital divide and the responsibility and actions needed by educators for future resolution. So before we begin, I'm going to talk about how today's session is going to unfold, and then I will be inviting our speakers to the stage. So we have prepared a few questions to get us going. So we're going to have a little bit of some pre-prepared questions to get us going, but I want you to get involved as well. So we've got the chat box and where everybody is now saying hello. Please put your comments and thoughts in there. I am watching it. We've got a wonderful team of moderators who are also watching it, and I'll try and bring in as many of your comments as we can as we go through the next 90 minutes. You'll also see a tab that says Q&A. So if you've got any questions that you want me to try and get into the discussion, please put them in the Q&A box, and hopefully at a suitable moment in the conversation, I'll be able to bring your question in. Okay, so do get involved. While we will be obviously finding out what our experts think, I think it's really important that this is a forum for us all and everybody has a voice. Okay, thank you, David. I like the Roger that Sir attitude. That's a good one. So do pop your comments in the question box, in the chat box, and any questions in the chat box. Okay, shall we get going? Shall we bring our speakers on to stage? So we've got 3 people in the panel today. We've got Keith, we've got Zarina and Denisha, and you put them in exactly in the order that I had them down. So rather than me introduce them, what I'm going to do is hand over to them and give them a few seconds for them to introduce themselves and tell us about who they are, their work, and how they see the frame or their framing for the next 90 minutes. Delisha, you're the person next to me, so would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sean. Hi, everyone. I am Delisha Davids. I am a lecturer at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and my primary focus is pre-service teacher education. I will then for today particularly be looking at that hat and be speaking from the perspective of what I experience daily with my students, as well as sort of the deep reading that I've been doing as I'm in the early stages of my PhD research, with a focus on pedagogical digital agency, but particularly from a sociological approach. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but that's the framing I come in today, and I'm so excited to share a bit of the South African perspective, some of my own experiences, and of course lots and lots of research. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you, Delisha. I've got a question immediately to the audience. Pedagogical digital agency. So would you care to just to expand on what that is so people are aware?
Yeah, sure. I think it's actually a term in development, but it's about bringing together the qualities of the teacher, their experiences, and putting the digital and the teaching methods together. A lot of the literature that we find is either sort of deterministic in it says technology will change how we live, and some, particularly in teacher and education research, say pedagogy should be first. And so I'm trying to bring those three terms together, and really to understand it in relation to one another. So not privileging the one or the other. So that's how I would define it at the moment.
Thank you. I think it helps the audience to access what it means with the explanation, and it sounds really interesting, actually. So going round my window, Zarina, you are next in line. Zarina, you were here with me in the panel, the previous panel, so it's great to see you again. Could you just remind people who you are, what you do, and what your frame for this panel is?
Certainly. I'm delighted to be back here on the forum. My name is Zarina Saban, and I've been an ELT teacher and teacher educator for over 30 years. I started off in the classroom teaching English in different countries around the world, but I entered there from a science background. So I was doing a lot of content and language integrated learning, CLIL, until I did my master's in linguistics in TESOL, and started going down the teacher education route. And I thought I was taking on just another job when I went to the Himalayan country of Nepal and experienced teaching and teacher training in extremely rural conditions, no electricity, no running water, those kind of conditions, just chalk and talk. And learnt a great deal about teaching with very few resources. And that world opened up to me the problem that female students have, girls and young women in education. So I suppose in terms of this session today, that's sort of my approach that I'm taking, girls' education.
Thank you very much, Sharina, and as I say, it's a pleasure to have you back on the panel. And last but not least, Keith, over to you. Could you tell us who you are, etc., please?
Thank you, Sean, and good to be here and to be able to participate in this event today. My name's Keith Sonnet. I'm Chief Executive of Computer Aid International, and I'm pleased to be part of this because our core mission, since we were established 25 years ago, was to bridge the digital divide by providing access to the technologies and also the skills for people to use it, but also to do it in environmental friendly ways. So we specialize in providing low cost, low carbon equipment, and we regard ourselves as being part of the circular economy and to ensure sustainability of electronic devices. So in our 25 years, we estimate that we've saved over 80 million tons of CO2e, the equivalent of about planting 4 million trees. So we're very keen on bridging the digital divide, and as I said, happy to participate today.
Thank you, Keith. Just to the moderators, could somebody type to Lorna because she's stuck on the video? She probably needs to refresh her screen. She can't hear us, so we need to type it. Delisha, I'll begin with you if I can, since you're the person next to me. I mean, we're talking about bridging the digital divide, but I think the audience might have a different understanding of what digital divide is. I think if you do use the internet to look up that term, you get quite a few interpretations of the definition. So I think the obvious first question, and I'll go around to everybody, but I will go around the window. So Delisha, when we talk about the digital divide, what do we actually mean, and how important are education and research when we talk about global disparity? So nice.
Yeah. A warm-up question, thanks. I think you mentioned the disparity, and particularly in terms of the digital divide, it is about the access to the physical resources that one gets access to when you have technologies around, connectivity. I think we often forget about connectivity because you can have cell phones and iPads and all things around, but if you don't have connectivity, that also, of course, is a barrier. And particularly in the education space, the digital divide, so not having access to resources, also means not having access to the same amount, but also perhaps quality of information that gets activated in the learning process. And I think for me in particular, it is also to look at, how different socioeconomic factors play into that. gender, race, etc. Particularly in South Africa, the disparity around digital access is still across racial and socioeconomic lines. And that, of course, is a legacy of our past. And it's been really tough to redress that. But I think also when we speak about the digital divide, we have to also think about what happens, that the divide that also happens sort of in the minds of people, in the way in which we see ourselves, because of the lack of access. So I think I'll stop there. I'm sure the other colleagues have much to add, but that's sort of the framing that I have about it, yes.
Perfect. Thank you. That's a really meaty definition for us to get into. Serena, would you like to add anything? Do you think Delisha nailed it in one go there?
I think she pretty much has, actually, Delisha. I would add that there's the aspect of age as well that I think plays into that, as well as connectivity issues. During the pandemic, a lot of parents had to assist young children online to be able to have some form of education. And they were either struggling with not enough digital devices in the home for everyone to be able to work and study at the same time. Or some parents, maybe the only digital device they had was a cell phone, and accessing documents that are sent may be difficult. And that also adds, I think, to the gap that is created.
Okay, so we've got age, we've got equipment access, we've got connectivity. Keith, anything to add to that?
Well, I agree with the other two panelists. There is not just one digital divide. There are many digital divides, and some of them have been mentioned. There's also a digital divide for people with disabilities. There's people who are obviously low income, and as Serena just explained, until COVID, everybody thought in the UK that the digital divide was elsewhere, in Africa and least developed countries. Then people had to stay at home, couldn't go to school, and suddenly the digital divide became a big, important issue in the UK. So all these complicated issues that need to be addressed and looked at require education and research, which is critical to overcoming many of the problems we face. It's not just the digital technology, it's also the wider infrastructure, because so many people don't have access to energy and electricity to run those devices.
Absolutely true, and you're right, Keith. Obviously, living in the UK, for me during the pandemic, it was just eye-opening to see, the assumption that everybody could have digital, but then the reality that we couldn't. Just looking at the chat box, I can see the joy it talks about digital divide being working on an age, a region, and a socio-economic issue, which I think very much marries in with what you were saying there. Chris Fry, who I always seem to be online with at the moment, talks about it operating at all levels. So a learner might even with an iPhone might not find it easy to use a piece of technology with it, and that's true. Of course, the competency level of somebody with it there. In my capacity where I teach digital literacy at the university, I'm always amazed at how much the students, even though many of them are postgrads, don't actually understand how to use things and how that piece of technology works. Okay, so thank you. Hopefully we framed our discussion on what digital divide is. And if you do have a different opinion, or if you do want to give us your definition, do put it into the chat box, and I will get it in there as we go through. And again, a reminder that there is the Q&A box. If you want to ask us a question or have a question come through to the panel, do that. So, Zarina, I'm going to turn to you now because, as we previously said, you and I were on the original panel in November 2021. And I think we were both talking about how we rewatched it recently. But if we kind of try and take out some of the main points of that, I'd say that that we were saying that we can't assume all young people are digital competent, that we need to focus on the wider skills such as independent learning and critical thinking, especially if we're going to move into this kind of hybrid educational future. And we should always move towards a culture of always upskilling to ensure digital competency for educators, learners, and caregivers. Do you think these things are still true? Have the challenges and opportunities shifted, or do you think that that's still one of some of the major issues of the digital divide?
I think they're all equally valid still. Absolutely, yes. And perhaps the ability to study using digital technology, I think, needs to really be looked at. I'm hearing from teachers around the region. I'm based in Costa Rica, that although education has gone into a hybrid mode, there are some students who want to head to the classroom if they have a choice in the matter, because they're finding that they get distracted on digital technology and trying to study. And so they feel if they're put in a face-to-face situation, they're able to concentrate more. I was reading not so long ago in the UK that on various university campuses, students are searching for areas of their campus without Wi-Fi, so they are free from distractions, so they can actually get a period of concentration and study done. So digital connectivity isn't always a plus for education. It can be a hindrance. So I think study skills and being able to manage one's own time and concentration has been an issue for primary level students and teenagers in the classroom. Having gone through the pandemic, they seem to have lost that ability to be back in a study situation and being able to actually focus on something for any length of time. That length of time seems to have shrunk since we entered into, shall we say, the digital phase of education.
It's interesting. Yeah, I'm just thinking about my son in primary school. The teachers say that they missed like the key years because they were the formative years of being in education, and because they were out, they just don't know how to be a student. They don't know how to sit and do other things that the things that would have normally developed as skills if they'd been in school. You talked there about hybrid. Is Costa Rica still hybrid, or are you talking about education as a whole now being hybrid?
I'm talking about education as a whole being hybrid, and actually in Latin America, the tendency for private language institutes, for example, is that a lot of older students are choosing to stay at home and have remote classes, so that they're finding difficulty in getting their students back into the classrooms. So there's a 50-50 sort of situation for a lot of institutions where they're delivering some face-to-face classes and some students are insisting on remote classes.
Delisha, you kind of raised your eyebrows there as Zarina was speaking. Was that one of a surprise, or would you care to add?
Yeah, sure. I think you find sort of both of those realities, you know, on a continuum of people wanting and sort of seeking. I think a lot of it has to do with the idea of getting that connection and care back in the physical environment of the school as well. And you know, particularly in South Africa, we that kind of pastoral role that teachers play. You know, you couldn't have that necessarily during COVID, or it is difficult to connect in general. I mean, I struggle so much with students just shying away behind my camera doesn't work, or you know, my microphone is not working. And so I think for me that's the biggest struggle. One struggles to connect in a sort of purely digital space, and I think when some people are offered the choice, they will choose that more relational connection. And not to say that you know, relationality is not achievable in a hybrid setting, but I think one also has to look at the bigger picture around not just technology provision, but also, again, what's happening at the home. Is there support for learning? And perhaps that's a reason why you know, learners are either choosing to come to school And then again, on the other side of the spectrum, you also have people that just prefer and already have those kinds of base skills to study, in their own way and in their own intensity. So I think there's also a matter of preference that plays into that. But I mean, it resonates. A lot of it resonates with what I'm also hearing and the experiences that even our pre-service teachers come back with after they go to school practicum.
Yeah, this learning how to study, and obviously our focus is here on the digital divide, but it's come up a couple of times, and it's also got in the chat, this idea of the digital disruption, the fact that people can't concentrate or they find it hard to study because of so much is going on the screen. I can see Chris is kind of saying remind students to put their phone into airplane mode, which is a useful tip in class. But it's also outside. I find that my MA students don't study very well outside the classroom, because when they're trying to write, they're just being distracted by everything there. So again, I think that for me that does feed into this idea of digital competency with it, and part of that. Keith, anything you wish to add? I mean, we're kind of moving slightly into the hybrid nature of education, which we do have a question for, so we can go down that road. But Keith, is there anything that you wish to add?
Well, my experience is probably somewhat different than the other panelists in the sense that digital competency, there's not one digital competencies, there's a progression of digital competencies. And computer aid, we tend to specialize in the basic digital competencies, which is how to use a computer, how to get online and do simple things like that. And the fact is, the question you phrased was about young people. Are they digitally competent? And obviously they're not. But in our experience, it's the teachers who often are not digitally competent as well. Not just in Western societies, I know, but particularly in the countries we work in particularly in Africa and parts of Latin America and elsewhere. If I can give a little anecdote, Computer Aid put in 25 computer labs into 25 schools in the Amhara region in Ethiopia. And they never had any computers, and we trained teachers to develop their digital competencies. And I went and visited teachers' schools during the teaching, and hardly any of the teachers had ever used a computer. And in the training sessions, teachers of the age of like 45, 50, 55 put their hands up, asked questions and said, "What's the question mark for on the top right-hand corner of the screen?" It's basic skills that you have to start with.
Absolutely, Keith. And again, I think if I go back to the beginning of the pandemic, when there was kind of the pivot or the move online rather quickly in education around the world, it was very clear that teachers as a whole didn't necessarily have the skills to be able to manage in that environment with it. So yes, well, of course, we are talking about when we frame the conversation, we should be talking about teachers and students. And also, you reminded me there, I think that that question was framed about young people, but actually, and I see this in Britain outside of education, it's the more older people being excluded from society because they aren't digital. My neighbor feels pretty excluded because he doesn't have a mobile phone and he doesn't have a computer, and he can't actually interact in life because everything demands that it comes through those two things at the moment. So we shouldn't, even though as we're talking we might frame questions in this way or that way, we do as an audience do bear in mind that we are, I think, applying this to everything. Joy, just to know, I can see your question and I'll bring it in at some point. So panel, I'm going to just jump in our questions, our pre-prepared questions, to question 10, because I think we've talked about the hybrid education. It just feels right to talk about it now. So the question, therefore, and I'll start with Keith, because to give a different point of view on it, is the future of learning hybrid? Do you feel that that's something that you see coming from your aspect of digital, dealing with the digital education?
Well, I think with the spread of digital technologies and the development of digital skills more widely, that yes, it will become hybrid by nature. I mean, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about artificial intelligence and the revolutions it's going to bring to society, but particularly in education. And there are big question marks over the impact of it. But again, I keep emphasising our experience in computer aid, which is that we're a long way off having experiencing that in so many of the countries around the globe in which we work. People don't have access to the technology, and if they have access to technology, it's often not very good technology. There was a study done by American University looking at agriculture and the various applications that software applications been developed to help farmers in their work, particularly to find out what the prices of commodities could be sold for their produce in local markets. And all the farmers had mobile phones, and none of them had a smartphone. And the only two keys that the university researchers found the farmers could use was a green button and a red button. And they also found out that the most popular applications only applied in certain locations, and if you lived within walking distance of a particular market and you was going to sell at least 4.8 kilos of something or other, then the actual information you got was meaningless. So it's as basic as that in so many places.
Yes, I agree. And I think it's easy when we come from different places, different backgrounds, to actually not understand how varied digital access is and how they do it. Delisha, would you like to talk about hybrid in your nature and how it might look in practice?
Sure. I think I definitely think there is a reality where we are working towards a more hybrid model of education. But I also think, and particularly if we're asking the question about how does research serve to bridge the digital divide, I think the research has to also be very particular about the context, so that we can actually study context and relations and people and technologies and connectivity and everything that's sort of in this kind of assemblage of or around the child and the teacher. As to, yes, we want to make generalizable statements about, for instance, the future of hybrid learning. But I think in terms of particularly this issue, that particularity of research and experience and empirical cases is so important. I definitely think, I say to my students often, our program is meant to prepare them to teach in a traditional classroom where they'll have chairs and monitors and all of these kinds of things. But I do think that they need to even extend themselves to think about what does it mean to be an educator in this sort of digitized world, and it's going to become more and more digitized. So in that sense, definitely, and we need to prepare our teachers and we need to prepare our students for that kind of unknown future. And I think perhaps linking to some of the other questions or comments that have been made, I think that requires us to look at education and learning from more than just a skills and a competency perspective. I don't think skills and competencies are enough. So, yeah.
So when you say more than a competence and skills nature, just to clarify to you, what should we be looking at? What should we add to that?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite academics to read is Ron Barnett, and he talks about dispositions and being and becoming. And I think oftentimes that is left out of the conversation when we talk about skills. We take it into a cognition space. We think about, how you're able to apply something. And I'm interested in things like, how does courage or risk taking allow us to become more adaptive in this kind of futuristic world? So I might not be able to train someone on a particular piece of AI right now today, because tomorrow I don't know what it's gonna look like. But I can help them to build the capacity, but also those dispositions that says I'm going to try something new and try something different. And I think that is a slightly different way of looking at the skills or competencies required for this kind of digitized future.
Thank you. Zarina, just to finish the circle, do you have anything to add on is hybrid the future and what it might look like?
I think it has to be the future because we can't go back to how it was before. Definitely, yes. But to follow on from what Delisha was saying, I think maybe what we need to be focusing on is mindset and building a certain resilience and mindset in people that we're working with in education. I think for the older student, remote learning and hybrid learning opens up more opportunities. And in parts of the world where public transport is poor and infrastructure is poor, and therefore higher education means moving to a city or traveling huge distances, I think that the hybrid and remote form of education is a godsend. The remote part of Nepal where I was living, Middle Hills and High Himal, had no electricity and is still very sparse with electricity. But because of mobile network towers, which have appeared since I used to live there, during the pandemic, college and university students could actually walk to the highest point in their area, get some kind of signal, and be able to access some material during the pandemic. So that sort of shift, that's a huge plus for girls' education, where there are societies and cultures who are reluctant to allow their young girls to move away and study in a city somewhere else, or don't have the economic capacity to support someone to be able to live alone elsewhere away from the family. Then for those kind of people to access education, it's a must. There was a question about flipped classroom.
There was,
and I noticed I was doing training on flipped classrooms, sort of 5, 6, 7 years ago, and it was like a nice theoretical thing. And here we are today, and it's almost the norm. If you have access to technology, you can spend more time in face-to-face situations, helping students cope with skills that increases their mindset and adaptability for the world that they live in. And the skills and competencies could be dealt with using digital technology by flipping the classroom.
It's true. When I saw the question come up, and it's come up a good time, my mind was thinking, well, does the flipped classroom actually help the digital divide? And I guess it does in a sense, but actually so the flipped classroom, if people aren't sure, is this idea of the material is kind of given to the student before a lesson. And I'm oversimplifying that, but so the students can work through the material before the lesson, and then the traditional lesson space isn't about input, but practicing and being productive around that. But I was thinking part of to help the digital divide, that the flipped learning only really works if the flipping is done in a way that is accessible, isn't it? Because you could actually, if you are, a lot of flipped learning centers around video, for example. And that actually makes it quite hard because it requires data, etc. I'm not being negative. Just my mind was going around the question. Serena, you immediately put your hand up.
It doesn't have to be digital. It can be.
Well, yes. Go on.
Yes.
Go on.
So the same principle could be used with material that you have to read through.
Okay.
And you can do that outside of the classroom and use precious face-to-face time, as Delisha was saying, where you actually connecting with your students on a human level, for them to be able to do things with that text, or if it's a video, or if it's a piece of grammar.
Yeah, if I'm going to get to this. If you're wondering why I keep looking down here, by the way, that's where the questions are coming on my screen. It's not that I'm ignoring the speakers. Delisha, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I think the sort of key word drawing from what Serena said is I think the hybridity of the future gives us that flexibility to allow for different pathways into, during, and outside of education. A group of Mandela Road scholars and myself actually investigated this idea of these digital pathways and using, digital credentials to also do something about the in-progress learning, particularly when it comes to girls' education. There's a lot of reasons why they might have to stop their learning. And let's say you've done a year of undergraduate studies, you have nothing to show for that. And I think therein lies an exciting piece where you could use this idea of micro-credentialing as part to unbundle education, but for the purpose of providing these kinds of flexible pathways. So I think when we lean into that kind of innovative thinking about how education can become different, because what is on offer, that provides that really does decrease the the digital divide, but also just generally, social inequities because of girls' education. So I just thought I'd add that and really support Serena's point on that kind of flipped learning as another layer of flexibility into the teaching and learning. And that's just one way in which that can be done.
Actually, there is a question. Joy's question will fit in here in a moment. I think Delicia's quite right. The interesting, I think, one of the post-pandemic things is this growth in micro credentialing, which obviously existed before the pandemic, but there's a lot more focus on it. And I think this year the phrase micro learning has really come into it. So we're delivering education in these small chunks. So that helps in that. The question that came in from Joy, because you're both kind of talked about this already in a sense, so I think it's a good time to do this question. So Joy asks, is there a gender related digital divide in ELT classrooms around the world? Which I'm going to say you're going to think you're both going to say yes, but let's find out. Delisha turned her mic on first, Serena, so I'm going to go with her first and then I'll hand over to you.
No, I was actually going to say Zarina can answer this.
Okay, fair enough. Serena, go first.
Thank you, Delisha. Yes, there is definitely. I've experienced it. I've witnessed it. There are different expectations from teachers and parents and society of girls performing and what they do with the language. What is their qualification for? And remember, in certain parts of the country, in certain parts of the world, people have to pay for their education. Education isn't a given. It isn't provided by the state for free. Or even if it is, you're having to pay for books, materials, getting to and fro, food, lunches while they're at school. So it's an economic investment for families to make. And if the opportunities at the other end of education are not equal for girls and women, then education doesn't become equal either. So it's a fact around the world that salaries are higher for men for the same equivalent number of hours of work at the same level. And therefore, if men are earning more and they are seen as the breadwinner, they are the ones to focus on in terms of education. Therefore, families put more money into that. In the ELT classroom, I've witnessed a question being asked and the loudest voice, the loudest students get the attention and are chosen to provide answers. Girls they're not timid by nature, but they are culturalized to be timid. And therefore they have less of a voice, and they go through life having less of a voice. So yes, it starts at a very young age. I was reading about women in STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Women make up 19.9% of science and engineering professionals. That starts in the classroom. Yeah. And English as a language, as an international language, is used for subjects like that, to study, to research, to find more information. So women, young girls by the age of 10 are already being influenced about what kind of subjects are for them and what kind of subjects are not for them. And so I think it has to start with the teachers. We have to be mindful of exactly what opportunities we're giving to girls in the classroom to have more equity.
Thank you very much. Having heard the answer, Keith, do you notice this divide in the work you do?
Oh, certainly. I mean, there's been so much, quite a lot of research into gender disparities in access to digital technologies. Even if people don't have access to to computers, mobile phones are sort of ubiquitous everywhere. But the research has shown quite clearly that lots of families only have one mobile phone between them. And the person who uses the mobile phone is the man. and women have very little access to the mobile phones that families have. We were approached by the University of Zimbabwe about 3 or 4 years ago, who have computer laboratories. We provided them with computers, but they had undertaken research internally that demonstrated that the female students were not using the computer labs as much as the male students. And they wanted to address that because the female students were falling behind in their studies. And it was quite clear that the female students were more timid. The men were more boisterous, more bullying in terms of getting onto the equipment. And so the girls didn't actually go into the computer labs when they had the opportunity to do so. We, with the university, provided computer labs in the female dormitories in separate rooms. And the training of the female students just expanded, and they were provided with scholarships to take examinations, and the pass rate was much higher than for the boy students. In fact, the vice principal wrote to us and said they were now getting complaints from the male students that the women students had better access to the computers than they did.
So it shows that the equipment, the right approach to where the equipment goes, helps overcome that to a certain extent. Denisha, to come back to you now, you've heard both answers. Are you ready to give anything else, or have they done it all for you?
Yeah, I think they covered it absolutely. So I'm not going to add anything at this point.
Fair enough. Just going back to something that Keith said, because it does fit into a question that somebody asked, that Ashan asked. You talked about that. You gave the example there of the university you equipped, and Ashan was wondering that if a school, I think the particular example was a primary school. So if a school is well equipped, does that help overcome the digital divide?
Well, we saw it during COVID, didn't we? Most schools in the UK, for example, and most of Europe and the Western world have lots and lots of digital equipment and computers, and pupils have access to it. The problem is when they can't attend those classrooms and they're working remotely for whatever the reason is, they don't have it because their family might only have one laptop or one desktop between the family, and you can't participate in online learning if you haven't got access to the technology. But it's not just for young people, elderly people as well, who couldn't leave their homes. They were required, they needed rather, to have access to digital technology in order to order products online to be delivered to them, to keep in touch with friends and families, and for a host of other reasons. I was at a local London Underground tube station a few weeks ago, one of the few that actually still has a ticket office, and there was an elderly gentleman in front of me telling the ticket attendant that he'd lost his Oyster card, which is the card that allows you to travel on the trains, and it was explained to him that he had to apply for a new one online. And he said, well, how do I do that? Yeah. You need the digital technology to survive these days. And if you think of the situation in Ukraine with refugees fleeing into new countries where they never lived before, and they don't have a digital device, they've lost their phone, they've lost their laptop, or it's been damaged. How do you look after yourself without having access to that digital technology?
So ultimately, I know it's really good hand up. So to frame back to Ashan's question, okay, it's a starting point to have a well-equipped place of education, but it's not actually going to decrease the digital divide because of the reliance on digital within society itself. I think it would be a summation. Zarina?
And I think it's not enough if you're not going to train the teachers and assist the teachers in the use of those digital devices. I was working in Peru in schools doing teacher training on a large scale with the state of Peru. And some of the schools had been equipped with smart boards. They were there, but the teachers really had no idea how to make good use of them or even use them. So just providing the technology, it's like what international development was doing, 50 years ago by just building schools. Just providing the frame for something is not enough. we've got to have greater empathy and understanding of context and provide the help that teachers need to be able to feel confident themselves with that technology.
Thank you. Dinesh, straight to you.
Yes, and of course, agree completely on that point. The same thing happened in South Africa a few years ago when the rollout of smart boards happened. And I remember I was still a learner in a class, and it was a really good treat for us on a Friday where the teacher would just put a movie on the smart board. But we never really engaged with the technology in the way that I now understand it, that the affordances that it has. So I agree, and I think even the pandemic, and we were talking about crisis earlier on, when we shifted to online or hybrid education or remote learning, or all of the names that it has been called, we did so from a sort of crisis emergency response and not from an innovation wanting to move forward response. And of course, when you're innovating versus when you're acting in an emergency, those two responses are very different. And I think to a certain extent, when we took our teaching online in that crisis mode, we replicated a lot of archaic teaching, or chalk and talk, or I sort of called it was watching TV. So how is it that our learners could lay in bed with just listening to a lecture or a class and not really engage? And so really to the point that whether it's high quality or let's call it shoestring access, it does not equate to real meaningful learning. And of course, teacher education in service and pre-service is essential in that regard. But I also think, again, it cannot be done in a way that is not contextual. And it, of course, also has to help the teachers understand how to integrate it into their subjects as well. So just being able to switch on a computer doesn't allow me to know how to best use it for teaching, because there's another sort of divide in the sense of how I use my mobile phone or any kind of computer for my social and entertainment. We think that translates into educational purposes, using technologies for teaching and learning, and that also doesn't translate. I think that has been the biggest shock for me, sort of as an early career researcher and a novice teacher educator. Just because they have the devices, they're fluent on TikTok, they can edit videos. It doesn't mean that they can produce educational videos, even using the same kind of technology. So, yeah.
No, I agree. I smile because TikTok is something that comes up in one of my classes all the time. And my students are always horrified when I've never used it. I've never been there. Have you seen all the data? But they're amazed because that's the way of the world with it. I know that I've gone off the script of the questions that we prepared, but some of the questions coming up I think fit in better here. So I'll go back to the script after this question that Chris asked, actually, because I think it fits into what you were saying there. And Chris said, which is better, to concentrate the effort and resources to develop the digital competency of teachers or students, in the fact that the advantage of upskilling the teachers is that they could multiply the effort over. Do you have a thought on that? Would anybody like to come in on that? He said, teachers or students? Zarina, thank you.
Teachers.
Hey, that's great, because of the cascade effect, presumably.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd say teachers as well.
Okay.
Agreed.
Teachers. There you go, Chris. We've got a full house.
If you train the teachers, you leave a lasting legacy in the schools.
It's that old thing of teach someone to fish.
Yeah, so legacy is teaching people to fish or whatever. And I think actually that kind of resonates going back to the topic of gender as well. If we look in the comments that are coming in the chat box, a lot of people are talking about the teachers are being the vital role in actually influencing and changing and motivating as a way of closing any gender divide. Okay, Keith, you've been sat patient. I do have a question for you specifically, I think, framing your angle and going the other way. So Keith, as you said, you're the chief executive of Computer Aid International, which is the global charity, and has given, I think you said in the introduction, was it 14 million people or so access to technology. So with the development of technologies moving at this exponential pace, I mean, we've seen that with AI now. It's gone from nothing to everybody's talking about it. So with this development of the technologies at such a pace, how do we ensure that access to devices and digital connectivity continues to improve for all? And who's responsible for doing that?
Difficult question to answer, really. Who's responsible for it? Because the glib answer is all of us, really, in one way or not. I mean, we see ourselves as part of the circular economy, and we look to provide low-cost computers and other digital devices, and we do so, as I said in my opening remarks, on environmental grounds, because about 80% of the carbon used by a computer is in its manufacture before it's even turned on. So if you can extend its working life, you reduce its carbon footprint. And so we take computers from big companies who donate to us, who have policies of changing their computers every 3 to 4 years. We refurbish them and provide them at charitably to sort of partners, both in the UK, but also more particularly in least developed countries. And obviously that process always means that our specification of our computers and digital equipment increases all the time, because companies change their computers to buy newer computers with bigger processors, faster speeds, better battery life for laptops. And so our minimum specification for the equipment we provide is always increasing. But we have to ensure that whatever we provide is able to handle the modern software, because the operating systems become more power demanding, they require bigger memories, and so on. And we want to make sure that when we are working charitably with the partner organizations, schools, and others in the underdeveloped countries in which we work, that we're providing computers that are going to have a long life and also going to be able to handle the up-to-date software, because all the schools want to make sure that they're teaching their pupils, students, on the sort of industry standard software, which they're going to be using hopefully when they leave and get employment. Now, the actual need, the specifications that are needed varies. So primary schools, they have lower specification computers, but once you get into universities with engineering courses, they need much higher specification equipment. And really at that level, it requires government to take the lead on it. And virtually every country, I think, now has an IT curriculum which they want schools to follow in their country, in their particular countries. The trouble is, in so many areas, they don't provide the resources, or haven't got the resources to provide the technology. And so we've got examples where teachers are teaching in schools using polystyrene keyboards and polystyrene mice. And there are videos online on YouTube that shows teachers doing that, because there just isn't the equipment. So there's so much that we can do as a charity, but it's very small, but it needs more governmental and international concerted effort in order to provide it. And digital technologies underpin the Sustainable Development Goals and can make a huge, huge difference to achieving those goals. So if we're serious about it, resources have to be made available.
Thank you. Melita's resonating with what you're saying about storage there, that obviously the more devices get sophisticated, the more hardware, the more the software takes up space, and this becomes a problem itself, that the technologies we're developing for education don't actually work on the systems that we're providing because of operating issues, which I think is a good point, Melita. Devisha and Zarina, do you want to add anything there?
And perhaps, and sorry, Zarina, I might be preempting the question that was sort of prepared for me, but I think what I find fascinating about your approach, Keith, is sort of that intentionality about, lowering the carbon footprint while providing devices, because I think from a climate action perspective, which is also something that I'm quite interested in terms of, I used to teach environmental education. I think that piece for me is sort of the alarming part, is that we have sort of progressed in terms of wanting to close this digital divide, but at what cost to the planet in particular. And so I think the fact that that's the ethos, that's literally the aim of an organization such as yours, highlights the importance of critically thinking about the types of resources that we bring into the class, whether hardware or software, and also the way in which we think about the ethical commitments that we have as teachers, but also that people that supply and also manufacture, these kinds of hardwares needs to really think about. So I think, again, in terms of research, in terms of provision, our mandate has to be clear that it is from an equity perspective. It has to be underpinned by sustainability principles, and I think that is to be commended. And then maybe just one thing, I think in terms of access, particularly at the school level, a lot of the students, I'm quite enthusiastic about, how digital technologies change the way that education can be done, and also how we need to push back against some of that. But in most cases, the students would ask me, but what about, the limited access? And I think at school level, we have to think beyond the one device, one person sort of model, because there are innovative ways also in which we can bring, computer supported collaborative learning into the classroom, which is, there's both collaboration, it teaches communication, but it uses the PC as a hardware to enable that. So I think there are creative ways, and as you said, there are, I call it now sort of shoestring digital literacy. Our teachers are also responsive and creative and resourceful, and that doesn't mean that we should stop providing access, but I do think we can't wait until everyone has access before we teach digital literacies. And I think there is a myriad of ways in which we can go about that.
Oh, Zarina, you wanted to come in?
Yes, just to add really that what Keith was saying was really important in terms of the manufacturers of these computers. Every 3 years, companies are needing to update. Well, why are they needing to do that? That's because the manufacturers are producing these products that quickly go out of date, and to update, you have to actually change the whole laptop or computer. Well, there are ways of producing these products where you could just open up a computer and replace one part and update one part instead of throwing the whole thing out. There are companies who are beginning to do that with mobile phones so that they have a longer shelf life. So we're not updating our technology every few years. That's going straight into the ground, into landfill sites. It's polluting the planet. As Delisha was saying, we're at a point where we really need to do something about the climate and stop, well, not stop, but slow down the increase in global warming. So if we don't make the changes now, as Keith and as CEO is doing with Computer Aid International, thinking in terms of the circular economy, then it's a huge mistake. So it has to, I think, start with the manufacturers of these technological devices. But I think it's also high time that governments had specific bodies which were apolitical, which were responsible in terms of digital access, digital technology, digital training, whether it's in school or for the elderly, to be able to cope with everyday living. Otherwise, we're going to, within countries, we're going to sideline parts of society and just ignore them, and you can't do that as a society.
A lot of people agreeing with the points you're making as a whole there, especially regarding sustainability and pollution, etc. in the chat box. There is a kind of follow-up question, which I'll come to in a second, but just to people, some people are joining us. We are unbelievably already an hour into a panel discussion on how we are using education and research to bridge the digital divide. If you have missed any of it, it is being recorded and you'll get access to the recording later on. So we've been talking, just to frame for people coming in, we've been talking about what the digital divide is and how we might overcome it, what steps we could take. And the previous question was obviously to Keith, looking at how we can keep up with the pace of technologies. And it raised a couple of people actually asking, I think, obviously, because with your relationship as the charity and provision, but is one of the solutions to the digital divide the role of kind of public and private partnerships working together? Or does that present more challenges? Should there be more collaboration on the public governmental level, or does actually increase the difficulty of overcoming the divide? And Christian, I think, was the first person to ask that question. Keith, can I go back to you on that?
Well, I'm very much in favour of having public-private partnerships to try and overcome problems that societies face. And there's a big role for the state, but also a big role for the private sector. As a charity, we work extensively with large corporates who, for whatever reason, want to provide some social value and want to give back. It's a phrase which is often used, and so that's why they work with us to try and reduce their carbon footprint through making sure that the equipment doesn't go into landfill when they no longer want it, and it is, we maximise its reuse and therefore save the carbon that would otherwise be incurred by manufacturing a new device. But they also want to, through their corporate social responsibilities, their ESG policies, to create social value. Some people might say that might just be, for marketing purposes, but generally, large corporations realise that they need to be giving back to their local communities. They might not give enough, a lot of people would say, but we work with them and they put resources into that. But I think there's much more could be done on a national level between the public and private corporations to address the digital divide. I would like today when computer aid wasn't needed any longer. But at the moment, I can't see that. The World Economic Forum in its global IT survey about 2 or 3 years ago looked at the digital divide and said it's getting worse. It's not being reduced, but getting larger. So there's still a big role for us all to play.
Thank you for answering Christian's question. I was just at this moment, I was about to flow to Delisha, but she did warn us of the connectivity issues that she might have at this time. Zarina, do you have anything to add, or shall I move on to a new question?
I think that social responsibility that Keith was talking about, I think should be played upon, whatever reason that they are doing it for. Obviously, it looks good. Should be taken advantage of, I think. And governments give tax benefits to huge corporations and multinationals. You could do the same with companies who are doing things for the community, whether it's on a small scale or a large scale. It could be encouraged. And I think as well, calling out greenwashing, where corporate companies are pretending to have a green product or pretending to do things which are beneficial to the environment, but actually when you dig a bit deeper, they're not. So it could be sort of a carrot and stick, I think, of encouraging through taxes, through economic means, and also actually highlighting companies who are not doing enough. And I think that could bring about a sea change in behaviour.
And as you were speaking, Chris put into the chat box, there should be a cost associated with throwing away electronic equipment. This might stimulate purchase of upgradable devices. And that kind of sums up a little bit of what we're saying there. If you're wondering where Delisha's gone, everybody, by the way, she will come back. That we knew that there was going to be a power outage at about 2 o'clock in South Africa, where she is. Zarina.
I just wanted to add, actually, just following on from Chris's comment there, that education isn't all about going to university. You could be focusing on vocational studies and training people to be able to fix devices and replace parts of technology. That's a whole area that could grow if we had a bigger sort of focus on circular economies.
Well, it's interesting you say that because actually, what I think at the university here in Oxford, one of the priorities changed after COVID was actually to focus on lifelong learning rather than necessarily on the degree. And if you're looking, I think even in the Horizon report, which reports back on technologies in education, this year lifelong learning comes up. This idea that it's learning those little things and learning lots, not as you say, not just university education with it. So I think one of the post-COVID focus of education is more in this continuum. I think we mentioned it already, upskilling and where we're going with that and this continual learning aspect. Delisa isn't. Oh, she is about to come back. I think she might be just coming back into the room with us. I just paused to see if her mic's coming on because I was going to ask because it kind of fits in here a little bit before I move topic. Hello. Your timetable was absolutely correct. 2 o'clock, you completely vanished, and you're about to ask you about sustainability. So you did hint at this, and it has come up with the idea of we've got the idea of sustainability and also the pollution aspects of digital devices. So there was the specific question I had for you was. This is obviously one of your areas of research, is the role of education in addressing climate crisis. There is a climate session later on today, and I'll mention that again at the end in this forum. But how can bridging the digital divide, improving access, help us drive climate action and build a more sustainable future? Delisa, over to you on that one.
Thanks. That timetable, the person who switches off the lights, he's quite efficient. Yes, I think that's sort of the first thing, and Keith did mention this earlier on. Not having the power to really just power, or the electricity rather, to power these devices are of course that's one of the big pieces. But I think I spoke a little bit about that kind of responsible provision of devices. But I think on the other side, when it comes to content and being able to access educational resources that bring the message of sort of climate action home to our students is another way in which technology is able to help with that. So a few examples from my own classroom. So there's this project called Matrix in Antarctica that I've been a part of. And in December last year, we took a group of Matrix, so grade 12 students, to Antarctica, which of course is a one-in-a-lifetime trip. And you really get to experience what we mean when we talk about climate change. We got to experience what it meant to live sustainably, because everything that we took over to Antarctica, we needed to bring back, no waste, anything like that. And in lieu of being to actually experience that the visceral experience of sort of the cold and the ice and not having water, because it's a really dry continent, able to take some of the media coverage, some of the intentional video creation, and bring that into the classrooms that particularly at our university. We did a similar project. We took the same group of students that were actually quite lucky. Because our Antarctica trip got delayed, we took them to Mauritius. And those were then, that experience there was turned into a series of vlogs around Mauritius, the people behind the climate story. And I think particularly in that sense, think about virtual field trips, the same kind of cost that it takes to go on a physical field trip to experience, the sand and the soil. You can also do that through a digital experience. It's of course not the same, but it allows us to sort of bring out those kinds of emotive, the emotions in the students, and they're thinking about, I think sort of care and the emotional part of climate action is the one thing that activates and triggers. And the world is burning kind of discourse doesn't really work with the generation that we have. And so I think in that respect, providing access so that you can access these kinds of information and resources is another lens. And then, of course, I think, when we have access to this kind of information, but also, again, the kinds of skills that are required, and also that kind of desire to want to change the world in some kind of way, it is important to help our students think about innovative ways in which their careers, for instance, could be, towards sustainable action. So how do we innovate education, or how do we innovate the manufacturing of digital devices that has that kind of, again, ethical commitment behind it. And I think access to the information that comes as a result of the access to devices and connectivity is one of the big pieces that I'd like to emphasize there. But again, I think being able to physically see, I think of all David Attenborough's videos, and just, his way of bringing you into a story is so important, and being able to really see how climate affects people and not just this, sets of data that sits flat on a page. I think that's the educational opportunities that we have when we bring the digital, closer to our learners and our teachers and our parents. Yeah.
Thank you. I was at a conference last week, actually, an ELT conference, and I was asked, and we decided to have a strand of the conference talking and interviewing people about sustainability, teachers about sustainability. One of the things that actually surprised me, and I need to go back and think about more, is that teachers didn't really. We asked them about sustainability and how it, whether they would take it with a digital approach, be sustainable, or what sustainability meant in education, and I found that teachers actually couldn't give a concrete answer to that. And I think surprised me, because the word sustainability comes up quite a lot. And I think there's just an assumption that people actually understand what sustainability is. So for me, it's become a very curious area. Just on Delisha, what Julie said, any more comments coming in from Keith or Zarina, or are you happy with where we are? Zarina?
We've been talking about connecting with each other, and I think in terms of climate change as well, that could be done digitally. So communities of young people in education could connect with people on the other part of the world, where maybe climate change is a little bit more abstract for them, to actually have more empathy in terms of what climate change is affecting for real people on the ground. In Costa Rica, after a thunderstorm, you lose electricity, and therefore you lose connectivity. So even if you had your digital device, your internet connection, if you were in the middle of your exam and there was a thunderstorm, you'd be cut off, and suddenly you can't send off your answer. It would affect your grades. Did you actually complete the test or not? There's a whole set of repercussions. So that connectivity, that literal connection between people, I think is one real positive part of digital technology that can be used in favor of climate action and climate change and climate awareness.
Thank you. If you've got comments, do drop them into the chat box. If you've got comments particularly on this area. Keith, I seen you turn your mic on, so I'll give you the floor. Are you with me, Keith? Can you hear me? I'm not sure Keith is there. I'll come back to him. I can see he's got his mic on, so hopefully he'll come back in a moment with it. So loads of people apologizing for coming late. Don't worry, although you are quite late. We do only have about 15 minutes left, and there are lots of questions to go for. If you have joined us late, or you've had connection issues, it is being recorded. We are currently in the panel about how we are using education and research to bridge the digital divide, and I'm going to fire through some of your questions in a moment. Keith, can you hear us now? Are you with us now?
Can you hear me?
We can now, yeah.
Sorry. So what was the question you were asking me? Sorry.
You turned your mic on after Delisha had finished her answer. So I wondered if you wanted to add something about that aspect of the sustainability climate action.
I wasn't signaling to come in, sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Absolutely no worries. I'm going to fire a couple of questions for you. One of them I find quite interesting. This is to everybody. It's coming. I'll find the name of the person asked it in a moment. But are we now forgetting the lessons we learned in the pandemic? I think there's a bit of nodding of that.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I think there's still this kind of I don't want to say hunger, but there's still this lingering towards, can we go back to how it used to be? And I think particularly in our context, the kind of sigh of relief that has happened to be able to just have everyone in class again has to a certain extent, I think, gotten to the point where we have forgotten what we've learned during COVID. Definitely, I think there are some, and again, I think it's a spectrum. Some people, some teachers, who are taking those lessons and really thinking about how can I innovate, how can I prepare my students for the 21st century learning, and really building on those lessons. But I do think most people have relaxed back into teaching and learning practices that have really not done justice to our young people. But of course, the shake-up of artificial intelligence is another turn. But I think in general, we might have forgotten a little bit. Yes.
I was thinking we'd bring up AI as our final part of the discussion. Grace asked the question, by the way, just to name check the person with the question. Zarina.
Yes, I think governments are beginning to forget the lessons learned. I think a lot of teachers are still actually struggling in the classroom with the consequent effects of COVID. Children who were pre-primary or primary age during the pandemic, they didn't gain social skills of learning together and being together. They're in the classroom, and the teachers are having to cope with dealing with students who don't have those abilities, and having to reteach them in a way which they would have normally had by the time they reached them in the classroom. And then I'd just like to use actually some figures from the WHO from 2022, that 10.5 million children have lost one or both parents or a primary caregiver to COVID. The consequences of that are seen in the classroom for those children. So teachers, I think, are the last people to actually forget what has happened. For adolescent girls in sub-Saharan Africa, this has resulted in increased risk of sexual violence, increased exploitation, increased HIV infection, and reduced educational attainment. In Mexico, in the state of Campeche and Yucatan, there's been a 25% point decline in the ability to comprehend simple texts by 10-year-old students of low socioeconomic status, compared to 15% point decline in the equivalent group for higher socioeconomic status, and that's according to UN Women. So I think teachers are having to deal with the fallout in classrooms of the pandemic still. They're dealing with it, and yet their governments are often saying, oh, stop using COVID as an excuse. So I think yes and no.
I just think you produce lots of statistics there to back up your argument. It just reminded me, and I think you went through the chat box earlier, that the Oxford University Press published a paper called "Addressing the Deepening Digital Divide," and in their research, they found that 70% of educators said the most disadvantaged students lost their learning due to limited or no access to digital devices. So again, it fits into this picture. Keith, is there anything you want to add with that? And then I've got a couple of questions left. I think we've got about 10 minutes.
Well, I agree with what Zarina said. I mean, educators and teachers are dealing with the consequences of COVID and the lockdown we went through. But I think the focus from the digital divide, which was highlighted during COVID, has now dissipated somewhat, and like everybody's moved on to something else. So politicians have moved on to something else. Companies that were wanting to help and to solve problems of young people not having access to digital devices have now moved on to something else. So the focus has shifted, definitely.
It is amazing in the UK how much COVID has just vanished, doesn't it? I mean, it's still here, obviously, but it's not a topic of any discussion or in anything. It's been there, done that with it. I want to. There might be a lack of cohesion between some of these questions because I want to fire through a couple from the audience, if that's okay. And I really like Renee's question. So Renee Berta asked, "What's your stance on the idea of that the growing integration of digital education could contribute to the burnout of many students because of the speed at which technology requires students to perform educational tasks?" Which I think is an interesting question, that we're assuming that digital solves some issues, but does it actually contribute? I think at the beginning of our conversation, we talked about the digital disruption and this, and that which possibly falls into that. But does anybody have any thoughts on Renee's question? Serena first.
Go ahead, Serena.
Sorry, Delicia, I got there.
You need to get your hand up quicker.
Maybe it was my connectivity that just made it look like I got there first. I think the digital technology could be beneficial for students in the sense that by using these technologies, we're not providing a one-size-fits-all. It could become more personal. So students who need a bit more time can maybe rewatch a video several times before getting the information, or they could read and get the information, or they can get information from different sources. So I think that helps in terms of neurodiversity and how we learn and how individual we are. So I think depending on how it's used, like any tool, it can be beneficial, and it doesn't have to lead to burnout of students.
Thank you. Delisha, get your hand up quick. Get in there.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Zarina, but I think there's so much more that we don't understand between the relations of people and the technologies that we use. And I think this is sort of the kind of uncovering I'd like to do with the study that I'm busy with. And I just think to sort of my own experience in the morning, I programmed my alarm to go off at whatever time. And depending on my mood in the morning, it can have a certain kind of effect or it doesn't. But I also think, that constant, and I think this burnout is both for teachers and students, that the constant having to be available, or the perception that one is available 24 hours of the day, I think those things do contribute could contribute to burnout. But I think in that sense, it is again important to, when we talk about or introduce tools, technologies to our students and our learners, that we also have a conversation about the critical use of that and how to have boundaries. So in the same way that we would, and not from a place of sort of warning that it could be bad, but understanding how that interacts with how we are human and how we sort of interact with the world. So I think it's definitely, it has its opportunities, but I also think if we don't manage it well, as with anything, it can have detrimental effects. But I don't think we know enough yet about ourselves, our relations with the material, really, and I think there's lots to explore around that.
Yeah, I mean, from an educational standpoint, COVID actually was one massive research project, wasn't it? The amount of papers and learning of education on education, about education coming out because of this is because of COVID is really interesting. Keith, anything to add?
Not really. I can't really comment about burnout. All I know is that if I didn't have access to my laptop and my digital technologies and my mobile phone, my stress levels would increase considerably. And I guess all of us on the panel and everybody listening, stress levels would go up immediately.
Absolutely. Zarina?
I would just like to add, rather than burnout of students, I think it's more likely there'll be burnout of teachers. As Delicia was saying, that need to be present all the time. I'm working with teachers in Spain at the moment on one of OUP's courses, and they're 8 hours ahead of me. But that feeling that I've got to be there for them when they've made this comment in the discussion forum or whatever, that pressure I think may be greater on teachers than on students.
Yeah, I agree. I was reading the question as it was put to us, but I do agree that the burnout goes both ways. And I agree with I mean, some of the comments in the chat box, of course, that the burnout isn't necessarily related to digital. I mean, we've got to go back and consider the effect the pandemic had on us, the way the society changed. There's a lot of factors with it, and I don't think we're trying to say it is just wholly digital, but there are a number of things with that. We have got 6 minutes left. Panelists, I'm going to ask you one question, which has got to be about AI, really, and then as we come to the end of the discussion, I'll invite you to make if you wish, one wish about the bridging the digital divide, or one piece of advice, or one tip, and then we'll bring it to an end. Does that make sense? Everybody happy with that? A hard look if not, because that's where we're going. So thank you all for your comments as well. There are lots of questions that I haven't got to yet. I'm trying my best to get them in. If you do have comments on, then do put them in the chat box. We've got about 5 minutes left. As I said, we have got through almost the whole of the panel without mentioning AI, although ChatGPT did go through the chat box a couple of times. So I think we do need to address it just to be on trend, if nothing else. So this year, we've obviously seen the emergence of digital technologies, such as the launch of ChatGPT and the development of ChatGPT-4 and all the other things coming out now. So are these technologies going to fit in with, are they going to impact upon education and research? And will there be an impact on the digital divide because of the growth of AI? Big subject, 6 minutes to do it justice. Anybody want to go first? Nobody's settled their hands going there. Zarina, go on then. Zarina's like, she's got a little button that goes hand up.
I can't control it, sorry.
This one.
This goes up. Yes, I think AI could be really useful for teachers. It could be an additional tool. All the things that teachers tend not to like doing, the writing of tests, the marking of homework, those things could, in a way, I think, begin to be handed over to AI, and then that could be analysed. For example, you set a piece of homework, it's easy to mark, AI could do it, you get the data from it, and then okay, this is what I need to reteach, this is what I need to focus on, or this student needs help with. So I think it could be a great tool to help teachers to provide more personable kind of learning that fits the student. And again, moving away from one size fits all, from the traditional type of education. In terms of, is it going to affect equity? Yes, I think it is. Because for new technologies to be unbiased, women have to be involved in them. People from different parts of society have to be involved in them, and they're not being involved in them. One example I read in a book called Invisible Women. Virtual reality headsets are designed to fit men's heads. Not only that, they focus on the way eyes focus on an object, and the distance between eyes and size and everything matters. So the headsets actually fall off women, and they get motion sickness. And that's just one example of how a form of technology is being designed and forgetting a whole part of society, and that's the danger.
Thank you. You're right. I mean, obviously, you made the point about the women there, but of course, throughout AI, a lot of the problem is the models, the data with which they've been given to get going, and it does leave a lot of sections of society out of it. They're very heteronormative, atypical kind of data sets that go into it with it. We have got about 2 minutes left, which really isn't a lot of time. Keith, Delicia, who wants to go next? Keith, do you want to come in on AI?
Well, I mentioned it earlier that it's got the potential to revolutionise our lives, but we're only at the beginning of the AI development, and how it develops is going to be particularly crucial. I mean, like most technologies, new technologies, it can change for the good, but undoubtedly it will be used for purposes that we probably won't support. I just fear it might take the fun out of much of our lives if we have to rely upon artificial intelligence. But I think the future is really quite exciting in digital technologies. There's a lot of talk now about quantum computing, but we've just witnessed the first biological computer. And if we get once biological computers start being developed, which will be some years off, it will solve a lot of the problems about the use of about the environmental consequences of digital technologies. And we all contain a biological computer in our head. And development of biological computers, I think, will revolutionize more greatly than just AI by itself.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think when it goes back to actually to our original panel in November 21 when we were talking about AI, and at the moment, of course, it's quite a weak AI in the sense it's essentially a fast internet searcher for it, and it's when they develop and when those things come together that's better. I presume moderators, I've got a little bit of wriggle room because it is coming to 1:30, and I do want to hear Delicia's answer to this.
Thanks so much, Sean. Yeah, I think I definitely think so. Particularly as a teacher educator, my students who are pre-service teachers are looking to me to model the use of AI in teaching and good teaching practice. And so for me, there's a big sense of responsibility about how I engage them in conversation, about what we test, what we try, what we don't, the kinds of conversations that we have. So I definitely think it has and it should disrupt education in a way, but again, that we think about it critically. And also, I think and this is sort of also my end off, I think technologies like AI and whatever is developing is really, this is sort of one of my favorite thoughts that have come from all of these, engagements and webinars on AI, is that it has centered the question again about what is worth learning and what counts as knowledge. And also, I think more of a philosophical question. What does it mean to be human and how to be human in this age and with the technologies and in the kinds of communities that we're in, with or without connectivity? And I think those are the kinds of questions that I'm pondering about, but also then to say, how do we develop research practices that are interventionist in the sense that we find findings and they have real social impact for the kinds of communities that we are wanting to bridge this kind of divide. So I think it is a tool to be used and explored and to provide what we know as best as we can, and to really just roll with the punches as it comes along, but to be critical about that as well.
And I think being critical is important because I think you can see we're in the eye of the storm in terms of the hype cycle at the moment. If you go on any piece of social media or anywhere, it's like the educators are being given this about I use this, do that, do this. And if you're an educator coming in that doesn't know much about it, there is so much information being given out, and I think that actually goes against what we've been talking about here. It's not going to bridge the digital divide. It's just going to make accentuate the problem and turn off a lot of those teachers that have come to technology. Wow, we have been going 92 minutes, folks. I hope you've really enjoyed it. I am going to change my mind and just bring the panel to an end. So I'm not going to come back to you unless you've got with it, because we are over time, and I would hate the audience to miss going to teach because they're listening to us, as interesting as we are. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are coming to the end of this panel discussion. So if you did join it late, we have been talking about using education and research to bridge the digital divide. We have had three amazing contributors to this: Delicia Davis, Zarina Subban, and Keith Sonnet. And I think it's a good time to give them a little round of applause, which I will do physically rather than virtually, and thank them for their amazing insights